This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Chasten grew up in Traverse City, Michigan, and was raised in a conservative Catholic family. After graduating college, he worked as a teacher, and later he married presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg in 2018. His book, I Have to Tell You Something, was originally published in 2020 and has since been rewritten and republished as I Have to Tell You Something for Young Adults. He joined us for a conversation over Zoom to talk about his new book and message to the LGBTQ youth. Welcome, Chasten, to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
And so I Have to Tell You Something was originally published in 2020, and today we're actually talking about the young adult version. You completely rewrote this book for young adults. Why did you decide to do that, and what was that process like?
Yeah, I started rewriting it over 2 years ago, and I really wanted to write a copy of the book I wish I could travel back in time and hand my younger self. And when I started writing it over 2 years ago, the political climate was not the way it is today. And so I was just thinking about, young Chasten, what could have been helpful for him. And having been around the country and having the opportunity to meet with lots of other young, especially queer people, I knew that we needed more stories like this. But I had no idea that when the book came out, this would be sort of the topic du jour.
And how has the responses been like so far?
It's been phenomenal. I think I'm coming up on 30 cities and, I've done the big coastal cities, which have been phenomenal. I didn't get to go on a book tour, an in-person book tour for the first one because of COVID. So I've enjoyed traveling and meeting with people, but the response, especially in redder states, I've been to Florida twice, Texas, Missouri. I'm going to Tennessee this weekend. And that response has been so heartening to me. People are so exhausted and beaten down by the politics, and just to have that space and that community, even for an hour or two, is really necessary. And now that it's Pride Month, I think folks even more are searching for that community and that belonging, and to know that people are fighting for them and going to show up for them in red states too.
Right. And I think there is a lot of support, right? As you're saying, very hopeful, very heartening. But at the same time, we are still hearing voices on the other side. And as we've talked about before, right now in Granby, Connecticut, there is an ongoing debate over a video that was recently shown to students. Parents are very divided on whether or not the video should have been shown and if they should have been told before the video was shown. And the video was also made for kids ages 2 to 12. With what you just said and with what we were just talking about, how would you like to see LGBTQ plus history and studies taught in schools? And how do you think schools should recognize Pride Month?
Yeah, I wonder what my life would have been like had I read about people like Bayard Rustin or Marsha P. Johnson or Harvey Milk in school, had I known that there were other people like me out there who came before me, right, who had made these huge strides politically, personally. But I had never heard of them because I was growing up in a rural conservative place where we didn't talk about LGBTQ people. And I was raised to believe that something about me was wrong. That's why I kept it hidden for so long. And I think behind so many of these, quote unquote controversies, are some people still not believing that LGBTQ people are equal members of society. And you break many of these discussions down, I imagine what it would be like if the script was reversed. Would any parent be upset that a video featured straight people saying, I love being straight. I like knowing that it's okay to be straight. It makes me feel good that people affirm that it's okay to be straight, right? Nobody would be pulling their kids out of school if there was a video shown where straight people are talking about being straight, because that's almost every video. So behind that are just some people who are still uncomfortable with the fact that LGBTQ people exist, even though they may not think that. They may not think that they themselves are, bigoted or small-minded. But if you're upset about the fact that there is a video that exists where, someone is just saying, I like to be affirmed in my identity, or something that is making it easier for people to see the light at the end of the tunnel, especially young people who we know in this country are at a much higher rate of suicidal ideation, especially amongst LGBTQ people. And so behind all of this, I think, is this need to humanize LGBTQ people and realize that we've always been here. We will always be here. We're not going anywhere. And I believe that LGBTQ people should be treated as equal members of society.
And I think you mentioned, comfort space, and I also wonder if kids are so much better and adapted in showing who they are or voicing who they are. I certainly feel like I've talked to a lot of young people, and I always wonder, like, man, when I was your age, I can't talk about the things that you're talking about,
Yeah.
or I can't articulate what I'm feeling as so like professional that these kids are able to do, and not just
Yeah.
with their family. A lot of them are talking to the media, so I just can't imagine what's going through their minds. But you mentioned safe space, and I think for a lot of young people, schools are a safe space. They have their peers, they have teachers who may support them. So how do you think schools should recognize Pride Month? Do you think schools have a space for that?
Well, look, we still need a Pride Month because, as we mentioned, there are still people in this world who are trying to make it harder for LGBTQ people to exist. The data shows us that 1 in 2 trans kids will contemplate taking their life. It is a known fact that in some areas of this country, it is still unsafe to be LGBTQ. I remember when I was about 9 years old learning about Matthew Shepard and his murder. Matthew Shepard, who was taken in a pickup truck and left for dead, tied up to a fence post. And I was growing up around a lot of pickup trucks and fence posts. And while my life has changed, my story has changed, there are still a lot of people in pockets of the country, especially like the ones I grew up in, that are wondering if it's truly okay to be themselves. And until we can all say that, yes, LGBTQ people are equal members of society, then that's why we march. That's what Pride Month is for, to recognize that there is a portion of American citizens who are still asking for their rights, who are
And
still asking to be equal members of society.
And back to your book, you also described multiple journeys in realizing your own identity. Can you talk about what that experience was like, especially because you also talk about certain ways that you had to hide and mask your true self? I wonder if that would resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't know who to be. Some of my early role models were Ellen DeGeneres on television and Will and Grace, and what I was taking from that was, maybe you could be gay, but you should probably be funny. And so I really leaned into performance. I tried to make everyone feel good about my existence. So I tried to be funny, I tried to be entertaining, but I was also growing up in a more rural place. My family was heavily involved in 4-H, so I was raising cows from a young age. There's a chapter in the book titled "I'm Not a Cowboy." But yeah, I was playing all of these roles. I was just trying to figure out who to be so I could safely exist amongst everybody else, my peers at school or my church group or my 4-H group. And I just felt like for 18 years, I was just pretending to be many different versions of Chasten because I was afraid that if anyone found out this big secret about me, I would lose it all. And I definitely feel that resonating around the country with young people who wonder if it's okay to be themselves. And then I will meet 70, 80-year-old couples at the signing line who still don't recognize this country, the progress that this country has made, and then sort of the regression that this country is experiencing.
You also wrote that most often the fear of rejection or even violence pushes people further into the closet and forces them to hide their truest self from those who don't believe that LGBTQ plus people are equal citizens, worthy of being treated equally and with dignity. So Chasten, I want to ask, how do you think homophobia gets internalized? And in your experience, what was the result of that or the consequences of that?
Yeah, well, you know how we were just talking about sort of this newer generation kind of wondering why the adults are so bothered by someone that might be LGBTQ or wondering why it's such a huge deal. And I think not even for folks in our generation, but for an older generation, we were taught that being LGBTQ is bad. For me, I spent 18 years of my life believing that something about me was wrong or broken, asking God why he would have done this to me and wondering whether or not there was truly a path forward for me. So when you are constantly surrounded by that hate and you soak up that hate for almost 2 decades of your life, you kind of start to hate yourself. And so much of that experience busting down the closet door was, yes, feeling the freedom of being able to be myself, but also coming to terms with the fact that I was allowed to love myself. And I really hadn't loved myself for almost 20 years. And so that homophobia seeps in and it tells you that you are unworthy of all of those things. Which is why it's so important to tell the people in your life that they are loved unconditionally and from a very early age, so that we don't go throughout our life wondering if we're going to lose all of the people who say they love us once they find out, who we truly are, once we are able to share our most authentic selves with them.
And one of the central parts of your book was talking about your experience coming out to your parents, speaking of being in a space to do that,
Yeah.
and being told certain things. This was a conversation you first had with your mom. Can you describe to
Yeah.
us how that conversation went?
Yeah, I didn't really have the guts to come out to my parents face to face, so I wrote a letter, and I remember packing my bags, and I walked into the living room and I handed my mom the letter, and I apologized. I remember saying, "I'm so sorry," and then I left. I got my car and I drove away. And one of the really important stories that I get to tell on the book tour is how, after a couple of months of crashing on my friends' couches or floors or in my car, my parents called me home. They wanted to keep me alive. They cared about me and keeping me alive and my health and safety more than the opinions of their friends or their church group or their community. And it's that unconditional love that truly saved my life, because I was not in a good place. I didn't really see much of a path forward. So I'm so grateful that I get to share their story of progress and their allyship, willing to learn and unlearn some things because they cared more about their love for their child than anything else.
You talked about how your mom had a hard time accepting that you were gay in the beginning, but you described her as well-meaning. So can you help us
Yeah.
understand what you meant by that? Because I think it really points out to the fact that acceptance for some people, it's a process, and it's an ongoing
hmm
one at that, right?
Yeah. So I have always tried to, especially in my, public life and political work, I have always tried to um, think about building a bridge for other people to get to the right side of history. And I know sometimes we just want to like take the 2x4 and whack someone over the head with it. But I try to focus on laying the 2x4 down and building the bridge. And my parents were so loving. They were like the loud, well, especially my mom, like the loud, goofy mom. She brought snacks to all the football games and the baseball games, and she was always there on opening night for a play. And, my parents were the ones that always hosted cast parties or, tailgate parties. They were just so giving and loving. But we didn't talk about LGBTQ people. We never talked about it. And so I always assumed that that love was conditional, that should they find out that I was gay because of everything I was learning in school and church was telling me that I was wrong and broken and, destined for hell. I knew that once I came out that I would lose them. And they were they were well-meaning people, but we just never talked about accepting LGBTQ people. And so my parents too, their world was shaken as well, because like I write in the book, nobody hopes for a gay kid. That's what I thought. But what my parents proved to me was that the love and the safety of your child is worth so much more than maybe the dreams that they had of me, having a wife and kids, in the white picket fence. Well, now I just have a husband and kids, and the minivan. So they had to unlearn a lot of things that I think a lot of people need to unlearn. And that starts with meeting people where they're at, having the opportunity to hear their story, learn from them, empathize with them, walk a little bit in their shoes, and see that the only things that LGBTQ are the same things that everybody else wants: love, safety, community, the right to exist, the freedom to walk down the sidewalk and not be afraid that you'll get murdered, or that, it's not okay to hold the hand of the person that you love.
I hear from a lot of teachers who have mentioned that students have said that if the teachers identify as LGBTQ plus and are open to it, it helps the students a lot in terms of acceptance and being themselves and being comfortable in the classroom. So I would love to know, what are your thoughts about LGBTQ plus teachers carrying that burden on top of everything else? But it also
Yeah.
sounds like a case by case basis to me. What do you think?
Everything that I talk about, it's important to preface that safety should always come first. You should only come out if it's truly safe too. only have conversations with people about acceptance and equality if it is truly safe to. And for other people, you can't just say like, come out of the closet. People are counting on you because it might not be safe for them. When I was going to high school, I now know that some of the teachers I had in high school are gay or were gay. Well, I guess still are gay, but they weren't out when I was in high school. And I sometimes think about what that would have meant for me walking down the hallways, getting called the slurs, getting shoved into lockers, getting pushed down to the floor in gym class. Had I seen someone, happily partnered and they had a career and I would have had someone to look up to, a role model, but I had none. And they were terrified of losing their jobs. And, when I was a teacher in the classroom, it was never a part of my identity, that I felt like I was advertising, but there was a picture of, my husband behind my desk next to pictures of my dogs and, all of the other little knickknacks that you put behind your desk as a teacher, in the hopes that, somebody might see that and know like, oh, wow, well, look at him. He went to college, he got married, he has, a dog and he's doing well. And that just means a lot to someone to look up and see someone that made it out,
At the end of your book, you offer a list of questions for teachers and parents. And one of those questions is, should LGBTQ plus people have to come out to their peers and communities?
Yeah.
Related,
yeah.
Literally what we're just talking about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you should only come out if you want to come out. Like that's your information. That's your private information. But also like straight people don't come out. Straight people don't have to come out. They don't have to work up the courage to share this information about them, wondering whether or not they're going to lose their friends or lose their family or lose their jobs or their housing or their security. And so the idea is that you don't have to tell people. Also, you don't have to have a coming out party, or you don't have to write the letter, or you don't have to sit your family down and tell them, because that is your information. And I felt like coming out, especially for my generation, was sort of like a confession. Like, here's this piece of information I have, and it belongs to the world, and so it is my obligation to share it. And I disagree. I think we put too much pressure on people to talk about, something that belongs to them.
And sadly, we have to end this conversation soon, but I do want to ask you, I know we're having such a good time. I want to ask you last question. Just, is there a message or is there something that you would like to share with our listeners or just with young people too in general? What do you hope that they get out from this book or even just from this conversation? Something that you would like to say to them?
Well, for young people, one, I'm so sorry on behalf of all the adults that some people are focused on making your life harder right now rather than easier. And for the adults, please tell your kids that you love them unconditionally. Even if you think you're the kindest, biggest hearted person, unless you have sat them down and told them, I will love you no matter what, whether you're gay, straight, bi, trans, whether you want to be, a football player, a mathematician, I will love you unconditionally. I will always be here for you. That conversation can take 10 seconds and it can truly change and save lives.
Well, thank you so much, Chasten, for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy Pride.